This is just such an incredible, unique, rare experience. Very, very few people have got to experience this.
I'm Yussef Rafik and I'm a zoologist and former zookeeper. I've spent years working with animals, so I know how tough but also rewarding it can be. But now I want to try some of the more unusual wildlife jobs out there and meet the dedicated people behind them to find out if I have what it takes. Europe's largest land mammal, the bison, is back in the UK for the first time in thousands of years. So I'm really excited because today I'm going to be joining the UK's first ever bison rangers. The European bison nearly disappeared less than a century ago, hunted almost to extinction. But captive breeding and rewilding programs have brought this giant back from the brink. This species is the closest relative to the ancient steppe bison that once roamed the British Isles during the last ice age. They are ecosystem engineers, changing habitats in ways that benefit many other species. And now that the UK has a herd of its own again, the hope is that they might do the same here. I'm meeting their new ranger Don to find out more about what the project wants to achieve and how they hope the bison will restore the woodlands around them. So how many bison do you have to manage?
We've got at the moment, we've got 3.5. We've got the matriarch, we've got 2 younger females, and the one had a calf.
European bison usually live in close-knit social groups, with dominant females leading the herd. Here, the matriarch is 18 years old, and she decides when and where the herd forages. What is the purpose of reintroducing them? Are you hoping that we're going to replicate what we once had?
They've got this ability to create little microhabitats within the woods. And really what they're doing is they're creating homes for a variety of other species to survive and thrive here. Just by the way they impact the woods, how they move through the woods, how they feed by debarking and dust bathing, creating these big open dust bathing sites. They increase biodiversity. We can have a greater variety and abundance of species in the woods thanks to the bison.
As a keystone species, bison can hold an entire habitat together simply by being themselves. I'm really excited to see them in action, so we're heading into the woods to try and catch a glimpse of the herd. And it doesn't take us long to see the first signs of their presence.
This trail that we're standing on now was created by the bison, and as you can see, we can comfortably walk down here now.
Bulldozed it.
It's literally the size of a bison. It's amazing.
But obviously that's great for the environment and all the other species that it's going to bring in.
Well, they are literally, they're creating natural rides and glades, opening up the area and allowing light to penetrate through to the wooden floor. Bison are like walking seed banks. As they move through this area, they're collecting seeds in their fur and dispersing as they go, and fertilizing, as you can see, the dung.
There's plenty of dung.
And look at this. This is amazing. I mean, here you can see a great example of how they've been debarking the trees.
So this is what the bison's actually done. They've taken this bark off the tree.
Stripped the bark off this
to feed on?
Birch. They feed off it.
But bison have other uses for trees too. Some that can be very helpful when tracking these big animals through dense woodland.
Wow, Yussef, look at this. This tree is just at the perfect angle for them. And you can see what's been happening is they walk underneath the tree and they've been rubbing up. You can see how they've taken the bark off the bottom here, and you can see that's bison fur.
Wow.
That's bison fur.
Oh wow.
And what happens, the birds, they come and they collect this fur and they use it to line their nests. And it's like a little bison duvet. And
I imagine it's very insulated fur to keep the bison warm, right?
And there's a project ongoing at the moment to see if it increases the hatchability rate of the chicks. Really interesting.
So many impacts on all the animals.
Amazing.
The return of bison to our woodlands is encouraging other research projects too. A nice, fresh gift from these big herbivores suggests that we're getting closer, and it comes with a very special job for me. Analysing these massive poo samples helps us to understand the bison diet preferences better. I'm eager to get stuck in here. I'm gonna have to get a scoop. It's just cooling out to me. So how big of a scoop do we
get a nice healthy scoop, and we're going to take 3.
3 of these.
Pop it in the liquid.
These are quite a big poo, but how much do these bison eat every day?
Bison have healthy appetites. They can feed up to 35 kilograms of vegetation a day.
Wow.
And what goes in the front comes out the back.
Yeah, and it's a weirdly satisfying consistency, this, isn't it?
Yeah.
There we
we go.
You give it a shake, do you?
Yes.
Okay.
We're going to pop that in the fridge, in the vet room, and then they get collected and analysed.
So cool.
Very
That's
interesting.
Collected my first bison poo sample. Thank you so much. Samples collected, we carry on our search for the herd. Usually you'd be able to hear the bison moving around through the woodland from a distance, but the heavy rain is muffling their sounds, so we have to rely on other clues. So we're on the trail of the bison now. Are there any particular things we should be looking out for?
Yeah,
Okay.
so you can see they've been here. You can see the tracks. Tracks in
yeah.
the mud, and they've come down for a drink.
Along with a good sense of hearing, bison have an excellent sense of smell that they can use to keep track of their herd and to detect intruders like us. Even though they are already super well camouflaged, the fact that they know we are coming is making them even harder to spot. Okay, so some more prints, so they are heading up this way. As we get nearer the herd, I start thinking that it's probably a good thing they're aware of us. It's a pretty bad idea to surprise a herd of bison, especially as this one has a calf to protect. Then, suddenly, right among the tree trunks, Don spots a massive shape.
Look straight through. Okay. You can see a mom and calf standing next to each other. Oh wow, straight through. Right.
As the herd becomes more and more comfortable around us, we begin spotting more bison coming through the trees to investigate. I cannot believe how relaxed they are around us.
This is just such an incredible, unique, rare experience. Very, very few people have got to experience this because they haven't been here for thousands of years. And there they are, just there. And they're such a big, big animal. They're so well camouflaged, you can barely see them in amongst the trees. And we've really got to give it to Don for his tracking skills because I don't think I ever would have found these guys. So we can see the calf, we can see the matriarch.
The calf.
Is the mother there as well?
Oh yeah, she'll be just behind, just on the other side.
So all the herds tend to stick together.
The herd all sticks together.
Okay.
Very, very strong herding instinct. Yeah.
And is that a response to predation in the past?
I guess it might. Yeah, I guess so. It's part of their nature.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
That's incredible.
I would happily stay watching this herd all day, but it's important to remember that they're still wild animals. So to avoid disturbing them too much, we decide that it's time to leave. We came out of the woods because we wanted to leave the bison to it. We didn't want to disrupt them too much. But look who's followed us. Oh my god, that baby's adorable. The rangers leave out hay supplements to help the bison while they're still settling into their new home, which they'd come to investigate. Seeing the bison for myself, the impact they're already having on the woodlands after only a few months is clear to me. But this rewilding experiment goes beyond just the herd itself. The plan is to compare 3 areas of woodland, with and without large grazers, using not just bison, but also pigs, horses and other cattle. It's a giant and ambitious experiment, and I want to talk to scientist Cora to learn more about it. Well, I spent the day with Don looking at the bison in the woodlands and seeing the things they get up to. And how can you tell that this experiment is actually working?
So it's a very extensive monitoring program and there is a lot to it. Not only will we be able to see what changes over time and how that changes, but we'll be able to compare the very unique bison ecology and the impact of that.
Is it still early days to find out any results? Is it too early to see if they're having an impact?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 years of surveys done now, which is what we call the baseline, and that's just to figure out what we have on site before the animals arrived.
Are there any sort of flagship species in particular that you're hoping that will sort of bounce back because of the bison?
So we have flagship species that are here already that we monitor. This is a triple SI that is designated for Heath fritillary butterflies. So we're having a very close look at them just because we want to see, you know, what happens in terms of that flagship species.
Yeah. So what are you hoping to see from the results?
For us, what is really important is this really unique behavior of the bison, and the biodiversity and bioabundance is going to increase on this side. And ideally, and I suppose that's the main aim for us, is to be able to gather the evidence to prove that bison can be the nature-based solution
yeah.
or a nature-based solution in order to combat the biodiversity and climate crisis.
So if that does work, how will that impact the way that other woodlands are managed around the country? Will we see more bison be introduced?
That would be the ideal scenario.
Yeah.
This is the first time this is happening. It's a very experimental project, but hopefully it's going to be a positive one, and we will be able to pave the path for more of these projects around the country.
It'd be amazing to see more bison.
Yes, absolutely.
My time has come to an end, but being here has really helped me to imagine what these landscapes would have looked like thousands of years ago when herds of beautiful bison were just roaming freely. And it's also made me realise that as amazing as these animals are, they're just a small part of a much wider experiment to help restore the ecosystem. And it will be a few years until we see any of the results, but it's really exciting stuff, and I cannot wait to see what the future holds.